In the heart of the capital, behind walls of stone and guarded gates, power breathed quietly, deceptively. The palace, an edifice of authority, tradition, and ritual, was a world unto itself. Within its gilded halls, decisions were made that shaped the fate of millions. Yet, even here, where loyalty was expected, discontent festered. And discontent, when nurtured in secrecy, can become the architect of ruin. The story of this coup is not one of sudden betrayal, nor violence erupting without warning. It was a story of patience, of subtle manipulations, of whispers carried from one chamber to another. It began not with guns or soldiers, but with ambition, envy, and the quiet, calculating hands of those closest to the throne. To understand the plan, one must first understand the palace itself. Every corridor, every audience hall, every chamber was designed to reflect the authority of the ruler. But these same corridors, winding and secretive, offered perfect cover for plotting. It was here, among trusted advisers, that seeds of subversion were sown. Advisers whose faces reflected loyalty in the light of day, but who whispered of revolution behind closed doors. The conspirators were not outsiders, no mercenaries recruited from distant lands. They were insiders, men and women who understood the rhythms of power, who knew the rituals, the timing, and the weaknesses that could be exploited. They understood that true power did not lie solely in weapons, but in knowledge, in influence, and in control of perception. At first, the plan seemed almost impossible. The ruler, a figure both revered and feared, had ruled with an iron fist, yet maintained a carefully cultivated image of benevolence. He surrounded himself with loyalists, yet no palace can be sealed entirely from human ambition. Those who served him were bound by oaths, yes, but even oaths can be broken when the promise of power shines brighter than loyalty. The conspiracy took years to orchestrate. Every alliance, every betrayal, every conversation was carefully measured. A look exchanged in the throne room, a letter intercepted, a guard bribed. Each small act was a note in a symphony of subversion. And as the conspiracy unfolded, the palace itself became a stage, each room a setting for acts of calculated treachery. The plan was audacious, not simply to seize the throne, but to do so without plunging the city into chaos, without the world knowing until the moment of triumph. It required patience, cunning, and above all, an understanding that power, once centralized, can be both fragile and absolute. The insiders knew the palace better than anyone. They knew the corridors, the secret passages, the timing of guard rotations, the habits of those in power. But power is a living thing. It senses disruption, it tests loyalty, and it punishes mistakes. For every conspirator, the risk was total annihilation. Failure meant more than death. It meant disgrace, the erasure of families, the obliteration of legacies. And yet, despite the stakes, the plan moved forward. For ambition, once kindled, often becomes unstoppable. This is the story of a palace betrayed from within, of whispered alliances, of careful observation, and of the slow, inevitable collapse of trust that would change the course of history. It is a story not of heroes, nor villains, but of men and women navigating the shadows of power, where every word, every gesture, carries the weight of life and death. Every palace is more than stone and mortar. It is a living organism, a microcosm of society, its rhythms dictated by power, ritual, and fear. In this palace, the ruler's presence was felt in every corridor, in every decree, in the careful choreography of daily life. It was a world apart, a kingdom within a kingdom, yet every action within its walls reverberated across the entire realm. The ruler had ascended decades earlier, inheriting not only a throne, but a labyrinth of alliances, rivalries, and ancient grudges. His reign was marked by careful consolidation of power, by displays of wealth and authority designed to inspire both awe and obedience. Every gesture, every ceremony, was calculated to reinforce his dominance. But a throne is a fragile construct. Its stability depends on loyalty that must be maintained, nurtured, and occasionally enforced. Within the palace, ministers and advisors served as both instruments and observers of power. Their knowledge, their influence, could shape policy, sway decisions, or, if corrupted, dismantle the very authority they were sworn to uphold. These insiders were the palace's lifeblood, yet also its potential weakness. They walked a delicate balance between ambition and subservience. Some were motivated by personal gain, others by ideology, but all understood one immutable truth: proximity to power is both a privilege and a peril. Not all power resides in the grand halls. Even in the shadows of the palace, influence could be exerted. Servants, chamberlains, guards, they witnessed more than outsiders could imagine. Every whispered word, every unnoticed gesture could be carried into corridors of decision-making. In a palace, knowledge is power, and knowledge moves swiftly when ambition is at work. History itself was alive within these walls. Portraits of past rulers, chronicles of battles won and lost, treaties signed and broken, all served as constant reminders of the fragility of authority. For those plodding within, history was not merely lessons learned. It was a guide, a blueprint for ambition cloaked in subtlety and patience. The council, a stage of loyalty and intrigue, reflected the intricate hierarchy of the palace. Decisions were public, yet intentions were often private. Here, alliances formed and dissolved in measured silence. Advisors competed for attention, for favor, for influence, often while masking personal agendas behind smiles of respect. In such an environment, the seeds of conspiracy could germinate unnoticed, nourished by ambition and frustration alike. And so, within these walls, where power was both displayed and preserved, the conditions for betrayal began to emerge. The palace, a symbol of unassailable authority, was at once fortress and prison. Its corridors would soon echo not with loyalty, but with the whispers of revolution. And those who plotted knew that to strike, they would not only need courage, they would need to understand the palace itself, as few did. The ruler, for all his vigilance, could not anticipate the quiet accumulation of dissent. He trusted, and yet his trust was precisely what made him vulnerable. The palace, which had long been a theater of order and control, was transforming into a labyrinth of opportunity for those daring enough to navigate it. In the shadow of ceremony and ritual, dissatisfaction festered. Small acts of defiance, unnoticed or dismissed, became threads in a growing tapestry of conspiracy. The palace would soon witness a transformation, not through armies, but through whispers, manipulation, and the calculated ambition of those closest to the throne. Even the most disciplined palace has corners where loyalty frays. In quiet chambers, away from the gaze of the throne, murmurs began to circulate, small, seemingly inconsequential remarks, yet each carrying the potential to ignite discontent. Within these hidden spaces, ambition whispered to ambition, drawing men and women toward a vision of power beyond their current station. The conspirators were a mixture of veteran courtiers, overlooked officers, and ambitious ministers. Each carried grievances, some born of personal slights, others of ideological disagreement, yet all were united by a single ambition, the desire to alter the balance of power. Their meetings were rare, deliberate, and shrouded in secrecy, conducted in rooms where even the walls seemed to listen. Messages were whispered, letters smuggled, allegiances quietly tested. Trust was both weapon and liability, and every step required calculation. The conspirators understood that one misstep could be fatal, yet the potential reward, a seat at the apex of power, was irresistible. The palace, which had long appeared impermeable, began to reveal fissures that only the most observant could exploit. The ruler, confident in his authority, failed to notice the subtle shifts in behavior. Advisors who once deferred now questioned, subtly, the wisdom of his decisions. Allies began to linger longer in corridors, exchanging coded glances, testing loyalty not openly, but through small, deliberate provocations. In the shadows, influence quietly shifted, like water finding a crack in stone. Preparation was meticulous. Every detail of the palace's operation, the guard rotations, the timing of audience halls, even the schedule of private inspections, was studied, catalogued, and memorized. Knowledge, in this case, was not merely power, it was survival, and the conspirators learned that information could be weaponized more effectively than any sword. Yet the palace was alive. Its servants, its watchmen, its minor officials, each carried a fragment of truth, a piece of the larger puzzle. The conspirators exploited this network, cultivating silence and complicity where possible, and using observation as a tool to anticipate opposition. Trust, carefully extracted, became the currency of manipulation. Gradually, the conspiracy coalesced. What began as scattered discontent evolved into a coordinated strategy. Allies were identified, potential threats neutralized, and opportunities for decisive action were mapped with precision. Each conspirator had a role, each action a consequence. The palace, long a fortress of order, was now a chessboard, and the conspirators were plotting moves that would determine the fate of the kingdom. Ambition, once private, had become a shade enterprise. The conspirators recognized that timing was everything. The palace had rhythms, rituals, ceremonies, inspections that could be manipulated. To strike too early would invite disaster. To wait too long could allow suspicion to grow. In the careful balance of patience and audacity, the seeds of the coup were planted, invisible to all but the few who understood the palace as intimately as the ruler himself. The garden, a place of serenity by day, became a stage for plotting by night. Here, under the cover of shadows and silence, strategies were debated, alliances confirmed, and contingencies rehearsed. Every word carried weight, every promise held consequence. The conspirators were no longer simply discontented. They were architects of change, determined to bend the palace to their vision. Small errors, unnoticed by most, became instruments of the conspiracy. A misdelivered order here, a guard's hesitation there, a minister subtly defying protocol. Each event was catalogued, interpreted, and exploited. The palace, once a symbol of unshakable authority, was revealing its vulnerabilities to those who knew how to see them. And so, the stage was set. What began as whispers had transformed into a structured plan. The palace, a fortress of tradition and authority, was poised on the brink of upheaval. The conspirators had waited, observed, and prepared. The seeds of betrayal had been sown, and in time they would bear fruit, dramatically, inevitably, and irreversibly. Next, the plan moves from whispers to action. The conspirators will test loyalties, manipulate routines, and prepare for the moment when the palace itself becomes a weapon in the struggle for power. Every corridor, every chamber, every ritual will be exploited in a web of deception whose threads can snap only once. By the time the first act of betrayal began, the conspirators had mastered the palace as few outsiders ever would. They knew the schedules of guards, the habits of ministers, the timing of inspections. Every routine, every ceremony, every minute of the ruler's day had been observed, catalogued, and exploited. In a fortress designed to prevent intrusion, the greatest threat came from within. The plan was methodical. A seemingly minor deviation, a guard arriving a minute late, a servant delivering a message to the wrong chamber, was not random. It was engineered. Each disruption was a test of loyalty, a probe into the palace's defenses. And the conspirators watched and recorded, learning who could be trusted, who could be manipulated, and who might betray them first. Trust was currency. Servants and minor officials were bribed, persuaded, or coerced into silence. A whispered word in the right ear, a discreet promise of favor, a threat subtly implied, all were carefully calibrated to ensure complicity. Knowledge flowed upward and outward, shaping perception and controlling information. Within these hidden networks, the palace's apparent stability was unraveling. Manipulation was subtle. Policy debates, ceremonial orders, and everyday decisions were influenced not by confrontation but by suggestion, innuendo, and selective truth. The conspirators understood that power was not seized only through force, but through control of perception. By the time doubt crept into the ruler's mind, it was nearly imperceptible, yet irrevocable. Even the possibility of violence was a tool, wielded carefully. Weapons were positioned, readiness rehearsed, but the purpose was often psychological. The threat of sudden retribution, the presence of unseen eyes, the knowledge that even familiar hands could be instruments of betrayal, these were instruments more potent than steel in destabilizing the palace from within. Every minor official became a vector for change. A letter intercepted, a messenger misdirected, a guard subtly delayed. Each was a deliberate move in a complex choreography. The palace itself, designed to project order, became a living puzzle for the conspirators, each piece manipulated with precision and patience. Even the palace's architecture was exploited. Hidden stairwells and concealed passages allowed conspirators to move unseen, to convey messages, to position themselves advantageously. In the corridors meant to safeguard power, opportunity flourished. The palace had become a labyrinth not only of stone but of intrigue, each turn calculated to maintain secrecy and control. Observation was continuous. The ruler, confident in routine, unknowingly revealed vulnerabilities in habit and behavior. The conspirators catalogued these patterns: when he retired, when he met in private, how he responded to dissent. Every detail became a lever, a tool for manipulation, or a point of leverage in the eventual seizure of control. Practice was as essential as planning. Movements were rehearsed, alliances tested, contingencies mapped. Each conspirator had a role, each action a predetermined consequence. Success depended on timing, precision, and above all, silence. One error, one exposed intention, could collapse the entire enterprise. The stakes were total, triumph or annihilation. As the first light of day approached, the palace teetered on the edge of transformation. The conspirators, invisible yet omnipresent, had prepared the stage. The routines, the hierarchies, the rituals, once the pillars of authority, were now instruments of betrayal. What had been meticulous planning would soon become decisive action. And the palace, long a symbol of unassailable power, was about to witness its most intimate and dangerous betrayal. The mechanics of betrayal were now in place. The palace itself had been transformed into a tool of conspiracy, its corridors and chambers complicit in the silent orchestration of a coup. The conspirators had observed, tested, and rehearsed. And when the time came, the palace would not resist. It would obey, not by force, but through the cunning exploitation of its own systems. The conspirators will move from preparation to action. The first cracks in the palace's defenses will appear, loyalties will be tested, and the throne will stand on the brink of collapse. What follows is a night of tension, risk, and irrevocable decisions, the moment when planning becomes history. The night had arrived. 4 months, the conspirators had watched, waited, and prepared. Every movement, every routine, every whisper of dissent had been recorded, analyzed, and exploited. Now, the palace's defenses, the walls, the guards, the rituals, were no longer obstacles. They were instruments in a carefully orchestrated plan of betrayal. Silence became their ally. Every step, every glance, every whispered command carried the weight of destiny. The palace, which had long represented unassailable authority, was now vulnerable to the very people sworn to protect it. The insiders, those closest to the throne, held the keys to its undoing. Small adjustments, invisible to the untrained eye, were already in motion. A door left slightly ajar. A guard's route subtly shifted. A messenger delayed. Each minor disruption was a calculated test, ensuring that the palace's defenses would fail precisely where it mattered most. The conspirators had turned routine into a weapon. The ruler, confident in the loyalty of those around him, remained oblivious to the storm gathering within his walls. Years of authority, ritual, and fear had lulled him into a sense of invincibility. Yet the first cracks were already appearing. And once cracks appear in a structure built on perception, collapse is only a matter of time. Each conspirator knew their role with absolute clarity. One controlled access to the chambers. Another ensured that alarms would not be raised prematurely. Others were tasked with securing critical points within the palace, the council hall, the treasury, and the communication posts. Coordination was precise, almost surgical, because in a palace, one mistake could cost everything. Fear and loyalty became tools of influence. A hesitant guard could be guided, persuaded, or bypassed entirely. The conspirators had studied human behavior as closely as palace routines. Every doubt, every hesitation, every moment of indecision was exploited. By the time the palace sensed danger, it would already be too late. The palace itself became a labyrinth of opportunity. Secret passages allowed conspirators to move unseen, to coordinate silently, and to position themselves for decisive action. The corridors that had once symbolized control now facilitated the betrayal that would shake the heart of the kingdom. Tension began to ripple outward. Those not involved in the conspiracy sensed anomalies, though they could not identify their source. Anxiety spread quietly, like a pulse beneath the palace's marble floors. By manipulating perception as skillfully as reality, the conspirators ensured that confusion would accompany their strike. At precisely the appointed moment, the mechanics of betrayal shifted from preparation to execution. Doors unlocked, pathways cleared, and positions taken. The palace, once a symbol of unassailable power, was now a stage awaiting the opening act of revolution. The tipping point had arrived. The palace stood on the brink, balanced between order and chaos, loyalty and betrayal, life and death. The conspirators had exploited every weakness, every habit, every routine. The stage was set, and the moment for decisive action was imminent. What followed would determine not only who controlled the throne, but the future of the kingdom itself. The conspirators will move in unison. Secrets will be revealed, loyalties shattered, and the palace will be transformed in a single, calculated night. The first confrontation is inevitable, and the ruler will soon face the reality that betrayal had been brewing under his very roof. The night had arrived, charged with anticipation. Every conspirator was in position, every movement rehearsed countless times. The palace, long a symbol of absolute authority, was now a stage for its own undoing. The air was taut with expectation, each shadow a potential threat or ally, each sound a signal. Silence became a weapon. Guides were guided past their posts, doors unlocked in advance, and secret pathways opened. The palace's labyrinthine corridors, once a safeguard, now facilitated the conspirators' advance. Every step was deliberate, every gesture calculated, and every heartbeat carried the weight of consequence. Not all who entered the council hall were aware of what was to come. Some, loyal yet naive, became instruments in a greater design. The conspirators had woven subtle manipulations into the routine, ensuring that those outside the inner circle were in the right place at the right time, or, crucially, in the wrong place. Access was critical. One unlocked door, one silent maneuver, and the balance of power could be shifted irreversibly. The conspirators moved with precision, exploiting the palace's architecture, routines, and the complacency of those who believed loyalty was absolute. The ruler, confident in his authority and the loyalty of those around him, was vulnerable in ways he could not perceive. Years of power and ritual had blinded him to the possibility that betrayal was not external but internal, cultivated by those closest to him. The first acts of confrontation were subtle. A hesitation here, a diverted attention there, a whispered command. These small interventions cascaded into control. By the time the palace sensed danger, the conspirators were already several steps ahead, guiding the flow of events with ruthless precision. Every passage, every hidden door, every seldom used stairway became an instrument of strategy. Loyalists found themselves isolated, communication lines severed, and the palace transformed from a fortress of order into a stage for subversion. Control was not asserted by force alone, but by manipulation of space and perception. And then, the inevitable moment arrived. The ruler, confronted by the impossibility of resistance, faced the consequence of unseen betrayal. Years of authority could not shield him from the intricate web of planning that had been spun beneath his very roof. The palace, once a symbol of invincibility, now reflected the fragility of power itself. The execution was swift, decisive, and largely bloodless. The conspirators had understood that the palace itself, its routines, its rituals, its very architecture, could be turned against the ruler. In this controlled orchestration, the throne changed hands not by brute force, but through the quiet, relentless application of strategy and patience. The dawn revealed the result, a palace intact, yet fundamentally transformed. The coup had succeeded. The insiders had prevailed, exploiting every weakness and opportunity. The ruler's authority had collapsed not because of open rebellion, but because betrayal had grown in the shadows, nurtured by knowledge, patience, and audacity. The palace, symbol of power, tradition, and order, had been conquered from within. The mechanics of betrayal, honed over months, had reached their culmination. And as the city awoke, life continued as if nothing had changed, yet the very heart of the kingdom had been rewritten in silence, precision, and strategy. The coup was only the beginning. What followed was a period of consolidation, retribution, and transformation. The kingdom itself would be reshaped by the fallout. As alliances shifted, loyalties were tested, and the true cost of betrayal became evident. Power, once seized, demanded more than cunning. It demanded survival. The coup had succeeded, yet victory is only the beginning. In the hours and days that followed, the palace became a place of scrutiny, tension, and recalibration. The conspirators had seized the throne, but power demanded more than ambition. It demanded consolidation, loyalty, and an understanding that every act of betrayal leaves ripples far beyond the moment of triumph. The first priority was control. Those who had enabled the coup were rewarded. Those who had resisted were quietly marginalized or removed. The palace, once a fortress of predictable routines, was now a theater of vigilance. Every movement, every whisper, was scrutinized. Loyalty, earned through fear, persuasion, or opportunity, became the currency of survival. For those within the palace who had remained neutral, uncertainty became a constant companion. Some saw opportunity in the new order. Others recognized the fragility of authority. Trust, already eroded, became nearly impossible to restore. The walls that had once symbolized unassailable strength now reflected the precariousness of power when betrayal had been so carefully cultivated. And what of the ruler? Once the embodiment of authority, now a symbol of the limits of power when knowledge and ambition converge against it. His reign had ended not in battle, nor in public humiliation, but through quiet subversion, a stark reminder that the greatest threats often come from within, from those closest to the throne. Outside the palace walls, life continued with deceptive normalcy. Citizens, merchants, and soldiers alike were largely unaware that history had been rewritten overnight. Yet the ripples of change would extend far beyond the marble halls. Alliances would shift, policies would be rewritten, and the perception of power itself would be forever altered. Consolidation of power was neither instantaneous nor complete. Every move was measured, every action designed to reinforce authority and prevent counterplots. The conspirators had learned that seizing power is only the first act. Maintaining it requires constant vigilance, strategic foresight, and the ruthless understanding that betrayal often begets further betrayal. And yet, ambition is inexhaustible. The palace, though now under new control, would continue to be a place where loyalty is tested, power is contested, and intrigue flourishes. Every victory carries the seeds of future conflict, and every ruler who believes themselves secure must reckon with the inevitability of human ambition. The coup had been executed with precision, patience, and subtlety, but it came at a cost. Trust had been shattered, alliances fractured, and the palace, once a symbol of stability, now bore the mark of its own vulnerability. History would remember this night not for violence, but for the quiet, relentless orchestration of power, a demonstration of how ambition, knowledge, and cunning can alter the course of kingdoms. In the end, the palace remained standing, the city unaware of the drama that had unfolded within its walls. Yet the events of that night, planned, executed, and consolidated by insiders, redefined the meaning of authority. Power, it seemed, is most fragile not when attacked from without, but when betrayed from within. This is the story of ambition and betrayal, of loyalty tested and shattered, and of a palace that witnessed its own transformation. It is a story of power's fragility, the consequences of secrecy, and the enduring truth that history is often written not by armies, but by those who understand the subtle mechanics of influence and control. In the days following the coup, the palace seemed alive yet subdued. Every echo carried tension. Servants moved more cautiously, courtiers whispered in hushed tones, and even the walls seemed to remember the night when loyalty had fractured. Those who had been complicit watched with satisfaction. Those who had been caught unprepared learned the invisible cost of inattention. The conspirators moved swiftly to solidify control. Old alliances were dismantled. Positions of influence were reassigned to those whose loyalty had been proven, often through complicity in the coup itself. Every appointment, every order, served as a reminder. The palace was now under new authority, one that had mastered both strategy and patience. The ousted ruler, once untouchable, was removed with measured care. Violence had been avoided, but humiliation had been inflicted. History would record the change in power without bloodshed, yet for the ruler and his family, the consequences were permanent. Reputation, authority, and influence, their pillars had crumbled in a single night orchestrated from within. Beyond the palace walls, the city continued unaware. Traders opened stalls, children played in the streets, and life carried on with the illusion of continuity. Yet the true power, the unseen force shaping policy, commerce, and allegiance, had shifted. The conspirators understood that perception is as powerful as reality, and in the quiet streets below, they had won without a single cannon fired. The next challenge was consolidation. A successful coup does not end with the seizure of power. It begins there. Threats persisted. Not all palace officials had been neutralized, and whispers of dissent could resurface at any moment. The conspirators implemented surveillance, subtle interrogations, and ceremonial displays to reinforce authority. Control, they knew, is a constant exercise, not a static prize. The coup would be immortalized in chronicles, carefully curated to favor the victors. History is often written by those who survived to shape memory. Letters, edicts, and court records would be adjusted, truths reshaped, and subtle erasures performed to ensure that the narrative of authority aligned with the new reality. Even memory itself became a tool of power. Yet resistance never fully dies. In the corners of the palace, hidden from the public eye, those still loyal to the ousted ruler began to regroup. Plans of counteraction were quietly discussed, alliances reconsidered, and trust cautiously rebuilt. The cycle of ambition, betrayal, and vigilance, once unleashed, is rarely contained. History demonstrates that every coup plants the seeds for the next struggle. The palace, the heart of the kingdom, had changed irrevocably. Power was no longer inherited or absolute. It was earned, contested, and constantly defended. The night of betrayal had exposed the fragility of authority, the cunning required to seize it, and the cost of neglecting the subtle mechanics of loyalty. Those who thought themselves untouchable learned that control is an illusion when ambition finds opportunity. In the aftermath, even the smallest actions carried weight. Every ceremonial procession, every council debate, every seemingly mundane decision became a signal of stability or vulnerability. The palace, once a stage of rigid hierarchy, had become a theatre of vigilance, when knowledge and perception dictated the balance of power. Beyond the palace, the ramifications were already rippling outward. Governors, military officers, and distant allies began to adjust their allegiances. Diplomacy, trade, and military planning all required reassessment. A single night of internal strategy had reshaped not only the heart of government, but the very map of influence across the kingdom. The palace endured, the city endured, yet the lessons of the coup would echo through history. Power is fragile, authority is conditional, and ambition, once unleashed, cannot be contained. The mechanics of betrayal, the patient observation, the manipulation of routine, the quiet orchestration of influence, had rewritten the rules of the game, and in the quiet aftermath, the palace reminded all who served it, no throne, no matter how seemingly secure, is immune to the ambitions of those within. The conspirators were no longer merely victors. They were rulers in waiting, tasked with transforming opportunity into sustainable control. Every decision now carried a double weight, to consolidate authority and to prevent the very cycle of betrayal that had brought them to power. They scrutinized intelligence reports, assessed loyalty networks, and calibrated the flow of information, aware that a single misstep could unravel months of meticulous planning. Information became both shield and sword. Couriers, messengers, and minor officials were observed with the same intensity once reserved for enemies of the state. Every letter, every request, every meeting was assessed for alignment with the new order. The palace itself had become a nervous organism, sensitive to every ripple of dissent or deception. But not all accepted the new order. Loyalists to the former ruler convened in secrecy, plotting subtle resistance. Their tactics were patient, small acts of subversion, coded communications, and careful cultivation of sympathizers within the palace bureaucracy. Though defeated, they knew that history is rarely a single act, and every night held the possibility of reclamation. The palace adapted to the new power. Rituals were subtly altered to reflect the change in authority. Guards were reassigned, ceremonial parts modified, and ministers' positions recalibrated to ensure loyalty. Even the most mundane routines, meal schedules, inspections, and audience timings, were tools in the ongoing assertion of control. In this world, efficiency was inseparable from strategy. For the ousted ruler, exile became a period of reflection and plotting. Letters were sent to sympathetic governors and foreign allies. Appeals were made, not with armies or weapons, but through persuasion and loyalty networks. The palace may have been conquered, but the ambition that had driven a lifetime of rule did not fade. Power, once tasted, leaves a permanent hunger. The consequences extended far beyond the palace. Governors in distant provinces recalculated loyalties, diplomats adjusted alliances, and merchants gauged stability for trade. The coup had not merely altered the palace. It had reshaped the perception of authority across the kingdom. What had been an abstract fear of rebellion became a tangible understanding of power's fragility. Within the palace, the atmosphere remained tense. Even among the victors, suspicion lingered. Ambition, once restrained by circumstance, now vied with necessity. Those who had secured the throne understood that vigilance was perpetual, that loyalty is earned continuously, and that yesterday's conspirator could become tomorrow's rival. Power, in this environment, is never static. History itself became a tool of authority. Archival records were curated to highlight the legitimacy of the new rulers, while the subtleties of betrayal were coded into footnotes, obscure references, or quietly removed altogether. The memory of the palace, once a monument to order, was rewritten to reflect the triumph of strategy over tradition. Subplots persisted in the shadows. Those who had survived the coup but were not fully trusted now operated quietly, seeking influence, gathering allies, and ensuring that their voices would not be erased. The palace was alive with politics beneath the surface, a reminder that even victory carries the seeds of future conflict. The night of betrayal had ended, but the story of power and ambition continued without pause. The coup had transformed more than the throne. It had rewritten relationships, exposed weaknesses, and demonstrated that the greatest threats to authority are often invisible, cultivated in silence, and executed with patience. The palace endured, yet it bore the permanent mark of human ambition, the knowledge that control, however absolute it seems, can always be challenged from within. Even after the palace fell into the hands of the conspirators, power remained a living, breathing challenge. Victory is never absolute. It is fragile, sustained only by vigilance. Those who had aided the coup now plotted quietly among themselves, subtle rivalries forming over who deserved the greatest reward, whose loyalty was strongest, whose judgment was sharpest. Within walls that had once been symbols of unity, tension now simmered. Not all who survived were conspirators. Some were remnants of the old order, wary, calculating, and uncertain. Even the most loyal guards and officials had to adapt or risk isolation. Their compliance, sometimes voluntary, sometimes coerced, became part of the palace's fragile equilibrium, a reminder that power is maintained as much through fear as it is through respect. The ousted ruler, confined by circumstance but not ambition, sought to reclaim influence. Letters traveled in secret to distant governors, military commanders, and foreign allies. Appeals were made, promises offered, and subtle threats implied. Though the palace had fallen, the web of power extended beyond its walls, stretching into the provinces, courts, and distant lands. The struggle for authority was far from over. For the new rulers, consolidation required more than brute strategy. They had to master diplomacy within the palace, manage fragile alliances, and anticipate acts of sabotage. Every word, every gesture, every decision was scrutinized. Ambition, once the driving force of the coup, now had to be tempered with caution. The palace had become a chessboard where every piece could turn traitor, every move mattered, and mistakes were fatal. The ripples of the coup extended far beyond marble halls. Provinces recalibrated their allegiances, traders weighed stability, and foreign envoys reassessed alliances. What had begun as an internal palace struggle now became a kingdom-wide recalibration of power. Authority was no longer merely asserted. It had to be continuously demonstrated, managed, and feed. Despite careful consolidation, dissent persisted. Hidden networks of loyalists had begun to reorganize, communicating in whispers, secret letters, and coded gestures. Every routine patrol, every ceremony, and every council meeting became an opportunity to detect and neutralize these subtle threats. In the palace, vigilance was no longer optional. It was the very essence of survival. Exile, however, was not defeat. The ousted ruler and his allies studied the mistakes, observed the palace from afar, and quietly built a network capable of future influence. Their strategy relied not on direct confrontation, but patience and timing, knowing that history often favors those who wait while others celebrate fleeting triumphs. The palace, once a bastion of routine and certainty, had become an organism of suspicion and calculated strategy. Every glance, every conversation, every interaction was a potential signal. Victory had been achieved, but control was provisional, dependent on perception, vigilance, and the continuous orchestration of loyalty. Power, once seized, demands constant care. Ambition, once unleashed, is rarely satisfied. The conspirators had succeeded in the immediate objective, the seizure of the throne. Yet their actions ensured that vigilance, subtlety, and suspicion would now define palace life indefinitely. Each victory contained the seeds of future betrayal. Each achievement demanded the next calculation. History, after all, moves not in great battles alone, but in the quiet manipulations, choices, and decisions of those who understand the mechanics of power. Months passed. The palace adapted, the city remained superficially calm, and distant provinces acknowledged the new order. Yet beneath this veneer, human ambition continued to stir. Alliances shifted quietly, whispers traveled through corridors, and the palace learned to move with a new rhythm, one that was at once disciplined, watchful, and uncomfortably aware of its own vulnerability. Power, it seemed, was never permanent. It was a constant negotiation with fate, ambition, and human nature. The coup had ended, yet the story was far from over. The palace stood as a monument to both triumph and fragility, a reminder that authority can be seized in silence, maintained only by vigilance, and threatened by the smallest miscalculation. Betrayal had rewritten history within these walls, yet it also illuminated the enduring truth. The greatest power is not in armies or wealth, but in the patient, relentless understanding of those who inhabit the corridors of influence. The palace, once a place of predictable routines, now pulsed with quiet anxiety. Even the smallest staff felt the weight of the new regime. Kitchens that had served feasts for decades now prepared meals under scrutiny. Servants exchanged coded signals of allegiance, and every minor act was observed. In the aftermath of the coup, survival often depended on subtle compliance, not loyalty. The consolidation of power required categorization. Officials were no longer treated as equal participants in governance. They were evaluated, assessed, and placed into hierarchies of trust. The palace became a laboratory of loyalty, where observation, subtle interrogation, and careful reward or punishment ensured that authority would remain unchallenged, for now. Beyond the palace, the kingdom itself was realigning. Governors, provincial officials, and military commanders weighed the legitimacy of the new order. Alliances formed and dissolved quietly, some motivated by pragmatism, others by fear. The coup's consequences extended far beyond the capital. It reshaped governance, military strategy, and even commerce across the realm. Every province became a chessboard where loyalty was tested and influence carefully negotiated. Resistance did not vanish. Loyalists of the ousted ruler began to regroup, hidden in estates, rural fortresses, and distant towns. Their tactics were patient, coded messages, recruitment of sympathetic officials, and careful observation of palace routines. Though defeated in the immediate sense, they had not surrendered. History demonstrates that ambition deferred is not ambition extinguished. Even among the victors, tension simmered. Success had brought power, but also uncertainty. Who could be trusted? Which ally might strike first? Paranoia, once a survival mechanism during the coup, became a constant companion. Ambition, though achieved, carried an unseen cost, the mental toll of vigilance and the suspicion that every shadow hid danger. The ousted ruler, removed from the palace yet not from ambition, extended influence through diplomacy and subtle persuasion. Envoys carried promises and veiled threats, forging alliances in distant lands. His survival relied not on open conflict, but on knowledge of human behavior, loyalty networks, and patience. Even in exile, the game of power continued. Within the palace, life resumed a fragile rhythm. Ceremonial routines were modified to reflect the new hierarchy. Ministers, courtiers, and guards adjusted to new roles, subtly signaling allegiance to the new regime. Every handshake, every bow, every observation became a performance in loyalty. The palace, which once embodied order, now thrived on perpetual tension, observation, and subtle strategy. The impact of the coup was not confined to the palace. Merchants and traders watched for signs of instability, recalculating risks, while tax collectors and local officials adjusted their operations to align with the new authority. Even ordinary citizens, unaware of palace intrigue, felt subtle shifts in governance, trade policies, and law enforcement. Power, though centralized, reverberated outward, shaping daily life in unforeseen ways. Night brought no rest. The palace remained alive with observation, analysis, and calculation. Every letter, every conversation, every minor infraction was scrutinized. Authority required vigilance, and in these long hours, the new rulers ensured that the threads of control remained untangled, while potential threats were identified and neutralized before they could blossom into rebellion. The palace, though physically unchanged, had been transformed psychologically and politically. Its walls now bore the imprint of betrayal, vigilance, and ambition. History would remember the coup as a decisive moment, yet its true significance lay in the subtle reshaping of authority, loyalty, and human behavior. Power had been seized, but it would never be secure, and every act of control would carry echoes of uncertainty. The coup had ended, yet its consequences would resonate for generations. The palace endured, but as a living testament to the fragility of power, the persistence of ambition, and the human capacity for both cunning and loyalty. Authority, once assumed permanent, had been proven conditional, and in every shadowed corridor, every whispered conversation, every silent glance, the palace reminded all who dwelled within, power is earned, maintained through vigilance, and perpetually vulnerable to the ambitions of those closest to it. The coup was no longer an event, it had become a process. Power, once seized, demanded constant vigilance. The palace, for all its grandeur, was now a labyrinth of suspicion, careful observation, and subtle manipulation. Every corner, every corridor, every ceremony was observed for signs of allegiance or dissent. Power is measured not only in authority but in information. Every minor official was evaluated, every interaction logged. Those deemed loyal were rewarded. Those deemed questionable were monitored or reassigned. The palace had become a living system of surveillance, a network designed to reinforce control and neutralize dissent before it could manifest. Beyond the walls of the palace, ambition persisted. The ousted ruler, stripped of immediate power, cultivated a network of loyalists. Their meetings were secret, their communications coded. The strategy was subtle, patient, and deliberate, to regain influence not through direct confrontation, but by exploiting openings created by human ambition, error, or negligence within the palace. Inside the palace, life adjusted to a new rhythm. Ceremonial routines, once static and predictable, now became tools to demonstrate allegiance. Courtiers learned to signal loyalty in subtle ways. The timing of a bow, the positioning in a council, the phrasing of a report. Every gesture became a test, every word a potential signal of fidelity or rebellion. The influence of the coup rippled outward. Governors, military commanders, and provincial officials recalculated their allegiances. Letters traveled discreetly, promises were made, and veiled threats hinted. The stability of the kingdom depended not only on the palace but on these distant actors, who could tip the balance with a single decision. Power, it seemed, was a web rather than a throne. Resistance never vanished entirely. Even those defeated in the initial coup retained knowledge, skills, and networks. These loyalists moved quietly, gathering intelligence, seeking allies, and waiting for moments of vulnerability. In the palace, every corner became a potential stage for renewed ambition, every whisper a possible catalyst for disruption. Even triumph carries its own burden. The victors, while celebrating success, faced an invisible threat, ambition among allies. Who could be trusted? Which confidant might turn opportunistic? Victory, while tangible, demanded mental vigilance as much as strategic skill. In the corridors of power, doubt was as potent as any sword. The palace evolved into a theater of controlled tension. Every council meeting, every guard rotation, every ceremonial procession was observed, interpreted, and used to reinforce loyalty or detect dissent. The victors understood that authority was not static, It required constant maintenance, vigilance, and a subtle orchestration of perception. Beyond the palace, the kingdom shifted in subtle ways. Trade routes were evaluated for stability, taxes recalibrated, and officials reassessed their allegiances. Citizens may have observed little directly, but the underlying currents of power now shaped daily life. Law enforcement, commerce, and military presence all bore the imprint of the recent upheaval. Even from afar, the exiled ruler exercised influence. Letters and secret instructions ensured that the threads of loyalty stretched beyond the capital. In the game of power, exile was not surrender. It was patience, strategy, and a preparation for opportunity. Ambition, once awakened, cannot easily be extinguished. As night fell, the palace seemed serene, yet it was alive with vigilance. The conspirators maintained control, but the memory of betrayal lingered in every shadow. Trust was a currency earned daily, and every action, no matter how small, carried weight. Authority, it became clear, was conditional, fragile, and perpetually contested. The coup had rewritten the balance of power, yet its effects were ongoing. Authority was no longer guaranteed by position alone. It was a living negotiation of loyalty, fear, and strategy. The palace endured, but as a reminder, power, once seized, is never absolute. Ambition, vigilance, and human cunning ensure that the story of influence, betrayal, and survival continues indefinitely. Even after the initial consolidation, the palace remained a crucible of strategy. Victory had been achieved, yet each conspirator knew that absolute control required constant vigilance. Intelligence reports, coded letters, and surveillance notes were examined with painstaking detail. The palace had become less a residence and more a command center, a living mechanism designed to preserve authority and anticipate dissent. Loyalists who survived the coup were not idle. Quiet observation, coded communication, and subtle influence became their weapons. Every meeting, every report, every change in routine was catalogued. The palace, now a theater of strategic maneuvering, reminded all that power is as much about information as it is about force. The ousted ruler, though physically removed from the capital, remained a potent actor in the political landscape. Secret envoys traveled between distant governors, sympathetic generals, and foreign envoys. Every instruction, carefully worded, aimed to nurture loyalty and exploit weaknesses within the new regime. Exile was not defeat. It was a pause, a preparation for a more subtle return to influence. Trust, once assumed, now had to be continuously earned. Guards were reassigned to unpredictable shifts. Ministers were observed during council meetings. Servants were subtly tested for compliance. The palace had become a living laboratory where human behavior was scrutinized at every level. Those who failed, even slightly, were quietly removed or reassigned, a reminder that the mechanisms of power operate invisibly as well as visibly. The consequences of the coup extended far beyond the palace walls. Governors and local leaders across the kingdom watched, waited, and recalculated loyalties. Trade, taxation, and military presence were analyzed for signs of stability. The kingdom was no longer united by tradition alone. It was held together by the perception of authority, and perception could shift with a single misstep. Even the victors were not immune to reflection. Triumph carried with it a weight that was both psychological and ethical. Every conspirator who had participated in the betrayal now faced a personal reckoning, the cost of ambition, the fragility of trust, and the burden of constant vigilance. The palace had been won, but at the expense of certainty, innocence, and peace of mind. Outside, life continued under the surface of quiet transformation. Trade networks adjusted, guilds recalculated their strategies, and the military monitored key locations. While the public saw continuity, the mechanics of governance had shifted. Authority was now laid, visible, ceremonial, and hidden, maintained by those who understood that power is fragile even when it appears absolute. The palace itself had become a living organism of observation. Every corridor, chamber, and courtyard acted as a stage for subtle performances of loyalty and surveillance. Minor officials, servants, and courtiers were both participants and instruments in the maintenance of control. The mechanisms of authority now depended on human behavior as much as architecture or force. Even from exile, influence extended through patience and subtlety. Letters carried directives to loyal allies, instructions for recruitment, and intelligence on palace routines. The ruler's absence from the capital did not equate to irrelevance. Rather, it allowed him to prepare, unseen, for the next stage of the struggle, a testament to the enduring nature of ambition and the persistence of strategy beyond immediate victory. As night fell, the palace retained its appearance of calm. Yet beneath the surface, human ambition and vigilance continued unabated. The victors understood that control was provisional, and that every gesture, decision, or lapse could ignite instability. In this carefully balanced world, authority was never permanent, and loyalty could not be assumed. It had to be continuously cultivated, observed, and enforced. The coup had altered history, yet its consequences were far from over. The palace endured as both monument and warning. Power is fragile, authority is conditional, and ambition is a force that can never be fully contained. In every corner, corridor, and chamber, the echoes of betrayal and vigilance persisted, shaping not just the rulers, but the very soul of the kingdom itself. The game of power, once begun, is never truly finished. It evolves quietly, persistently, endlessly. Morning brought light, but not clarity. The palace, outwardly serene, was a cauldron of strategy and suspicion. Every day, every routine, every minor task became an exercise in power consolidation. Victory had been achieved, but its permanence was never guaranteed. The victors had seized authority, yet the machinery of control demanded constant maintenance. The inner council of conspirators faced a delicate challenge, rewarding loyalty while neutralizing potential threats. Ministers were scrutinized, appointments adjusted, and subtle purges carried out without fanfare. The palace had become a stage for micropolitics, where minor gestures, whispered words, and small decisions shaped the balance of power more than any decree or battle. Even in exile, influence persisted. Letters and messages carried intelligence from distant provinces. The moods of governors, the loyalties of military commanders, and the subtle undercurrents of public opinion. Every scrap of information was a tool, every observation a potential advantage. History, it seemed, is often decided not on the battlefield, but in quiet study and patient calculation. Resistance persisted like a slow-burning ember. Loyalists, once marginalized or exiled, adapted to survive. They sent coded letters, observed palace routines, and quietly recruited sympathizers. Their work was invisible, their actions subtle, yet they reminded all that ambition deferred is not ambition extinguished. In the palace, even silence could be dangerous. Among the victors, doubt was pervasive. Success bred vigilance, and vigilance bred paranoia. Allies could turn rivals overnight. Gestures of loyalty could mask hidden ambition. The palace was no longer a space of comfort. It was a chessboard where every piece was capable of independent thought, and every move mattered. Ambition, once restrained by circumstance, now tested even the strongest bonds of trust. Beyond the palace, the kingdom itself shifted. Markets adapted, taxation was reviewed, and military deployments were subtly modified. Life continued under veneer of normalcy, yet every interaction, every negotiation, and every policy decision reflected the subtle hand of the new regime. The coup was not merely a palace event, it reshaped the kingdom's social and political fabric. The palace never truly rested. Intelligence, observation, and subtle manipulation defined governance in the weeks and months after the coup. Every messenger, every minor minister, every servant became part of a living network, monitored and evaluated. Authority was maintained as much through knowledge and perception as through overt command. In this environment, vigilance became the currency of survival. The exiled ruler's network grew quietly, patiently, and methodically. Every training session, every covert meeting, and every message strengthened the potential for influence. Ambition, once suppressed, now matured in secrecy. The ruler's absence from the capital did not diminish his power. It allowed him to prepare, to observe, and to exploit the smallest cracks in the palace's defenses. The palace had transformed into a living organism of vigilance and calculation. Every ceremony, every inspection, and every minor task became a signal, a test, or an opportunity. Even the smallest interactions were measured, analyzed, and used to reinforce authority or identify subtle threats. Power, once won, demanded constant exercise and continuous attention. The coup had altered the kingdom, yet its consequences would continue to unfold. Authority was no longer inherited or assumed. It was earned and constantly reinforced. Every shadowed corridor, every whispered conversation, every coded letter carried the potential to reshape power once again. History, after all, is not only decided by the visible battles but by the quiet manipulations of those who understand ambition, loyalty, and human nature. The palace, though outwardly calm, had become a fortress of observation. Every step, every gesture, every whispered conversation was scrutinized. The victors had seized power, but authority demanded more than a throne. It demanded vigilance. The smallest lapse could unravel months of carefully cultivated control. In this world, silence often spoke louder than words, and shadowed corners held both secrets and threats. Control is not absolute. It must be enforced continually. Ministers were reassigned, officials quietly removed, and alliances subtly reshaped. Every decision was deliberate, every move calculated. The palace had become a theater of strategy, where loyalty was tested at every turn, and even success carried the hidden weight of mistrust. The ousted ruler, removed from the center of power but not from influence, carefully orchestrated a network of loyalists across the kingdom. Letters, envoys, and subtle gestures cultivated allegiance, ensuring that the threads of potential counteraction remained intact. Exile was not a retreat. It was a stage for strategy, patience, and preparation for a future that could reclaim what had been lost. Even the smallest actors in the palace became participants in the machinery of authority. Servants timed their routines to convey compliance, courtiers adjusted ceremonial actions, and guards subtly shifted their patterns to align with new expectations. In the palace, perception mattered as much as decree. Loyalty was not assumed. It was performed, observed, and recorded. The reach of the coup extended far beyond the palace walls. Governors and military commanders recalibrated their allegiance, assessing the durability of the new regime. Every letter, courier, and report carried weight. The kingdom was no longer united solely by tradition or inheritance. It was held together by perception, fear, and carefully maintained loyalty. One misstep in a distant province could cascade back to the capital with devastating effect. Resistance simmered quietly, persistent as a slow-burning flame. Even those who had survived defeat found ways to assert influence, hidden from immediate view. Whispers, subtle gestures, and coded notes ensured that ambition deferred would not be ambition extinguished. The palace, seemingly static, was alive with a hidden network of observation and countermaneuver. Triumph carried its own burdens. The conspirators faced the invisible cost of ambition, suspicion, anxiety, and moral reflection. Trust was provisional, alliances fragile. In private, victories were tempered by the knowledge that yesterday's ally could be tomorrow's rival. Authority had been seized, but at the expense of peace of mind. Beyond the palace, life adapted under the subtle currents of power. Traders recalculated risk, guilds restructured, and ordinary citizens adjusted to subtle shifts in governance. Stability was a perception carefully maintained. Disruption lurked beneath the veneer of normalcy. The palace coup, while physically confined, had reshaped society itself, extending influence into every marketplace and provincial hall. Night revealed the palace's true rhythm: vigilance, surveillance, and strategy in quiet motion. Every messenger, servant, and minor official was observed and assessed. Decisions were scrutinized. Information was currency. Authority depended as much on perception as on decree, and even small lapses could carry immense consequences. The palace had become an organism, alive with calculation, observation, and potential threat. Even in exile, power is not dormant. Patience, intelligence, and careful orchestration became the tools of influence. The ruler's reach extended quietly across provinces, maintaining a shadow network capable of shaping events. Power, once centralized, now flowed invisibly, reminding all that authority is rarely absolute, and ambition can persist long after the throne is lost. The coup reshaped history, yet its consequences would echo for generations. Authority was never static, loyalty never guaranteed. Every whisper, gesture, and shadowed movement held the potential to alter the balance of power. The palace endured, yet it carried the imprint of ambition, betrayal, and vigilance. The story of human ambition, once unleashed, never truly ends. It evolves, quietly, persistently, endlessly. The palace awoke, outwardly serene, yet beneath its walls, the machinery of power continued to turn. Authority, seized in a single night, required daily vigilance to endure. Every gesture, every glance, every whisper held meaning. In this palace, survival depended on reading the subtle currents of human ambition and loyalty. The inner circle of conspirators balanced ambition with caution. Ministers were repositioned, minor officials reassigned, and subtle purges conducted without ceremony. Power was no longer simply held. It was engineered. The palace became a laboratory of observation and manipulation, where trust was fragile, and every decision carried the weight of future rebellion. Far from the capital, the ousted ruler cultivated a quiet network of loyalists. Meetings were secret, communications coded, and strategy deliberate. Exile was not surrender, it was preparation. The ruler's understanding of human behavior became a weapon, a tool to exploit weakness and reclaim influence in ways subtle yet potent. The palace staff, from servants to courtiers, became actors in the theater of authority. Timing of tasks, phrasing of reports, and ceremonial positioning all communicated allegiance. Even minor actions were scrutinized. In the corridors of power, perception mattered as much as command, and loyalty was something continuously demonstrated, not assumed. Outside the palace, the kingdom was realigning. Governors weighed the durability of the new order, military commanders tested loyalty, and trade officials adjusted operations. Stability depended on perception, not just decree. One misstep in a distant province could reverberate through the capital, destabilizing months of careful consolidation. Resistance endured quietly. Survivors of the old regime, now operating in shadows, maintained networks of observation, intelligence, and recruitment. Ambition, though constrained, continued to grow in hidden chambers. The palace, though outwardly calm, was alive with hidden movements, reminding all that power is never absolute. Even among the victors, doubt persisted. Triumph bred vigilance, and vigilance bred suspicion. Allies could become rivals, loyalty was provisional, and every action carried potential consequences. Success was achieved, but security was temporary. The palace demanded not just strategy but constant psychological endurance. Beyond the palace, the kingdom adapted. Traders recalculated risks, guilds reassessed priorities, and citizens adjusted to subtle shifts in governance. Authority was felt not only in the throne room but in the marketplace, the tax office, and the militia. Stability was maintained through perception and adaptation, not simply through decrees or displays of force. Night revealed the palace's true nature, a network of observation, calculation, and quiet manipulation. Every messenger, every minor official, and every gesture was noted, assessed, and used to reinforce authority or neutralize threats. Power was maintained invisibly as much as visibly, a constant negotiation of loyalty, perception, and subtle influence. Even in absence, influence extended. Letters and envoys moved like shadows across the kingdom, reinforcing bonds of loyalty, providing guidance, and observing weaknesses. Authority, once centralized, now flowed invisibly through networks of trust and calculation. The throne had been lost, but the game of power was far from over. The coup had changed history, yet its consequences stretched into every corner of the kingdom. Authority was never guaranteed, loyalty never permanent. The palace endured, but it bore the marks of ambition, vigilance, and betrayal. And in every shadow, every corridor, and every quiet gesture, the echoes of human desire and calculation persisted, reminding all that power is never fully secured. It is only held, moment by moment, by those vigilant enough to maintain it. Even months after the coup, the palace remained alive with tension. Authority, though established, was fragile. Every servant, every official, every guard understood that a single misstep could undo months of careful consolidation. The palace was no longer simply a residence. It was a battleground of perception, loyalty, and subtle influence. The inner circle of conspirators monitored the kingdom like a chessboard. Reports arrived from governors, military officers, and courtiers, each piece analyzed for threats or opportunities. Power had been seized, yet its maintenance required constant calculation. Even victory was provisional, contingent on vigilance, strategy, and foresight. From exile, the ruler's influence extended invisibly. Loyalists in distant provinces, sympathetic commanders, and clandestine networks kept the threads of his authority alive. Strategy replaced confrontation. Patience replaced aggression. The ruler understood that ambition, deferred, could be far more effective than immediate action. Even the smallest actors became instruments in the maintenance of authority. Servants timed actions precisely, courtiers chose phrasing carefully, and minor officials performed gestures that communicated allegiance. In the palace, perception mattered as much as power itself, and every act, however minor, could be interpreted as loyalty or betrayal. Beyond the capital, the kingdom's stability was tested daily. Governors weighed loyalty, military commanders measured risk, and merchants observed the flow of power. Authority extended outward through perception, not merely decree. One miscalculation in a distant province could ignite unrest or provide the exiled ruler a foothold to influence the capital. Resistance endured quietly. Survivors of the old regime, operating in shadows, observed, recorded, and communicated. Their actions were subtle but persistent, a reminder that power is never absolute, and ambition continues even when temporarily restrained. The victors, for all their success, faced invisible burdens. Suspicion of allies, fear of betrayal, and moral reflection became companions. Authority, once achieved, demanded mental as well as strategic endurance. Every victory carried hidden risks, every achievement potential danger. The ripple of the coup reached every corner of the kingdom. Commerce adjusted, local administration adapted, and military presence was rebalanced. Stability was maintained not through spectacle, but through constant observation, subtle recalibration, and careful management of perception. Authority extended outward invisibly, affecting daily life in ways the public rarely noticed. Night revealed the palace's hidden rhythm. Surveillance, observation, and subtle manipulation defined governance. Authority depended on vigilance, information, and perception. The palace, alive with calculation, had become an organism of power itself, a reminder that control is both delicate and relentless. Even from afar, influence persisted. Letters and envoys moved silently, reinforcing loyalty and exploiting vulnerabilities. Absence did not signify weakness, it created opportunity. The throne had been lost, but the game of power, ever persistent, continued beyond the walls of the palace. The coup reshaped the kingdom, yet its consequences stretched beyond sight. Authority was fragile, loyalty conditional, and ambition enduring. The palace endured as a monument to vigilance, betrayal, and ambition. In every shadowed corridor, every whispered conversation, and every coded letter, the struggle for power continued. History is rarely decided in a single moment. It is woven quietly through patience, strategy, and the relentless pursuit of influence. The palace had become a world unto itself, governed as much by perception as by authority. Every gesture, every glance, every word carried weight. Even months after the coup, vigilance was the currency of survival. Loyalty had to be proven repeatedly. Suspicion lingered like a shadow over every corridor. Power is never static. The inner circle of conspirators knew that even small cracks could lead to collapse. Ministers were reassigned, minor officials quietly removed, and alliances constantly tested. Each action was calculated, each word measured. The palace was less a residence now and more a living organism, responding to the ambitions, fears, and decisions of those within it. The ousted ruler, removed from the capital but not from influence, cultivated a network of hidden loyalty. Envoys carried intelligence across provinces. Secret meetings built alliances. Exile was a weapon in itself, patience and strategy replacing open confrontation. Every subtle decision increased the potential to reclaim power when opportunity arose. In the corridors and council chambers, even minor gestures conveyed meaning. Timing of bows, phrasing of reports, seating arrangements during ceremonies. Every detail was observed, interpreted, and recorded. The palace functioned as a theater of power, where performance and perception mattered as much as decree or force. The kingdom beyond the palace was no longer bound solely by tradition. Governors and commanders measured the strength of the new order, adjusting allegiances carefully. Even minor officials in distant towns could influence outcomes. Perception of authority was fragile and constantly tested. One misstep could ripple back to the capital with catastrophic consequences. Resistance persisted quietly, a slow-moving undercurrent beneath the palace's surface. Survivors of the old regime observed, recorded, and communicated in secrecy. Their influence, though invisible, remained potent. The palace's calm exterior masked a complex network of observation and subtle defiance. Even the victors were prisoners of their own success. Suspicion of allies, fear of betrayal, and moral reflection weighed heavily. Every gesture, every decision carried risk. Authority, once gained, demanded constant attention, vigilance, and endurance. Triumph brought neither comfort nor peace, only new challenges in maintaining control. Beyond the palace walls, the kingdom adjusted to subtle changes. Trade routes shifted, guilds reorganized, and citizens adapted to modified enforcement and taxation. Power was exercised not only in decrees but through perception, subtle influence, and the careful management of daily life. Stability, it seemed, was as much psychological as structural. The palace never truly slept. Information flowed constantly. Letters passed covertly, courtiers observed each other, and minor officials became unwitting instruments in the maintenance of authority. Control depended on knowledge as much as on presence. Vigilance was constant, invisible, and unrelenting. From his distant vantage, the ousted ruler extended influence quietly, methodically, and effectively. His absence from the capital did not diminish his power, it transformed it into patience, observation, and strategic intervention. Authority had been displaced, but the game of power persisted, invisible yet potent. The palace, city, and provinces were now intertwined in a delicate balance of power. Authority was conditional, loyalty tenuous, and ambition relentless. Every shadowed corridor, every whispered message, every subtle act carried consequence. History is shaped not by a single event, but by the careful, persistent interplay of strategy, vigilance, and human ambition. And in this palace, as in every center of power, the struggle continues, unseen, enduring, and ever-evolving. Even after months, the palace was a living organism, every corridor and chamber infused with calculation. Authority had been seized, but it was never secure. Every gesture, every bow, every whispered word could signify allegiance, or signal betrayal. The victors had learned that power is as fragile as it is intoxicating. The inner circle scrutinized every piece of information. Intelligence from distant provinces, surveillance of palace staff, and reports of minor dissent were analyzed with meticulous care. The palace was no longer merely a home of rulers. It had become a command center, where strategy and vigilance dictated survival. Even minor officials could shift the balance of power if underestimated. From his distance, the ousted ruler remained an active force. Networks of loyalists, couriers, and sympathetic commanders ensured that influence extended far beyond the capital. Exile was transformed into strategy, allowing patience, observation, and precision in preparing for opportunities that could restore lost authority. Power, once displaced, persisted quietly, like an ember beneath ashes. In this palace, even the smallest actions carried weight. Courtiers timed phrases in reports, servants executed minor routines with precision, and guards adjusted patrols to signal loyalty. Every gesture was observed, every deviation noted. Authority was performed as much as it was exercised, a constant test of allegiance. Across the kingdom, governors and military leaders weighed their allegiances. Stability was fragile, contingent on perception, intelligence, and subtle manipulation. Even minor officials could tip the balance. Authority, once taken, was not a fixed possession. It was a careful negotiation, maintained daily and observed constantly. Quiet resistance persisted like a shadow threading through the palace. Survivors of the old regime maintained observation networks, recorded behaviors, and communicated covertly. Power, though seized by force, was contested invisibly, reminding all that ambition never truly dies. It only waits for opportunity. Even the victors were prisoners of their own success. Suspicion of allies, fear of betrayal, and moral reflection weighed heavily. Victory offered no comfort. Every success carried the potential for unforeseen consequences. In the corridors of power, triumph was provisional, and trust was a fragile currency. Beyond the palace, the kingdom adapted to a new reality. Trade networks shifted, taxation systems adjusted, and military deployments were subtly reorganized. Authority flowed outward, felt not only in decrees but in daily life. Stability was as much psychological as structural, maintained through perception, influence, and subtle enforcement. The palace never truly slept. Couriers passed letters in hidden compartments, minor officials were quietly observed, and conspirators exchanged intelligence in the shadows. Authority now relied as much on knowledge and vigilance as on formal command. Every gesture could hold meaning, every word could shift loyalties. From afar, the ousted ruler's influence persisted. Letters, envoys, and careful observation maintained a web of loyalty across provinces. Absence did not diminish power, it transformed it into strategy and patience. Authority had been lost, but the struggle for influence continued, invisible, persistent, and precise. The palace, city, and provinces were now intertwined in a delicate balance of power. Authority remained conditional, loyalty fragile, and ambition relentless. Every corridor, every whispered message, every subtle act carried consequence. History is shaped not by a single act of violence or triumph, but by the careful, persistent interplay of strategy, vigilance, and human ambition. In this palace, as in all centers of power, the game never ends, it only evolves. The palace never truly slept. Even in the dead of night, it pulsed with calculation. Authority had been seized, but the machinery of power demanded constant attention. Every shadow, every corridor, every minor gesture could conceal threat or signal loyalty. Months after the coup, the victors understood that control is not granted. It must be continuously earned, maintained, and defended. The inner circle monitored every detail. Reports from distant provinces, accounts of minor disloyalty, and surveillance of palace staff formed a constant stream of information. Even small actions could ripple into consequences far beyond the corridors of the palace. In this delicate balance, knowledge was power, and observation was survival. The ousted ruler's reach extended far beyond the capital. Letters traveled secretly, envoys moved like shadows, and loyalist networks in distant provinces awaited instructions. Exile, far from diminishing influence, had transformed it into patience and precision. Ambition, carefully cultivated, became a weapon invisible to all but those who watched closely. In the corridors of power, even the smallest acts were observed. Courtiers timed phrases, servants adjusted routines, and guards subtly shifted their patrols. Every gesture carried meaning. Authority was performed as much as it was exercised, loyalty had to be continually demonstrated, and suspicion was a constant companion. The kingdom outside the palace was a living test of perception and allegiance. Governors calculated risks, military commanders measured loyalties, and merchants adjusted trade flows. Authority was conditional, maintained by perception, and fragile in its execution. One misstep, one miscalculation, could trigger unrest capable of reverberating back to the capital. Resistance persisted quietly, like a thread woven through the palace walls. Survivors of the old regime maintained networks of observation and influence, recording behaviors and transmitting intelligence. Their presence reminded all that power, even when seized by force, is never absolute. Even the victors were prisoners of their own success. Suspicion of allies, fear of betrayal, and moral reckoning became constant companions. Authority demanded vigilance, patience, and endurance. Every gesture, every decision carried weight. Every victory contained the seeds of new uncertainty. Beyond the palace, life adjusted quietly. Commerce adapted, taxes were recalibrated, and the military reassigned posts. Stability relied on subtle perception, enforcement, and social adaptation. Authority flowed outward invisibly, shaping daily life in ways citizens only partially perceived. Night was the palace's true stage. Information moved like a current through corridors and chambers. Couriers carried secrets, minor officials acted as instruments of observation, and conspirators exchanged intelligence in the shadows. Control depended on vigilance, knowledge, and subtle influence more than on decree or display. From his distant vantage, the ousted ruler's influence persisted. Even absence was an instrument of power. Letters, envoys, and covert operations ensured that loyalty endured and vulnerabilities were exploited. Authority, though displaced, remained active, patient, strategic, and invisible. The palace, the city, and the provinces were bound in a delicate and enduring balance. Authority was conditional, loyalty tenuous, and ambition unyielding. Every corridor, every whispered message, every coded action carried consequence. History is not written in single moments of triumph, but in the careful, persistent interplay of strategy, observation, and ambition. And in this palace, as in all centers of power, the game continues, unseen, relentless, and unending.